My research so far has focused primarily on Hegel's engagement with skepticism, in particular, ancient skepticism is kind of what I've taken a look at pretty closely. In that, I kind of, typically focus on kind of the epistemological questions that I see Hegel kind of grappling with, but also, I'm mostly interested in the metaphysical significance that Hegel finds in skepticism. That is, basically its relationship to negativity. So that's kind of where I've been for the most part in my kind of scholarly work. But around somewhere around January 6th of 2021, I started becoming interested in the question of the extent to which we can think about forms of skepticism as pathological. And so I've been kind of shifting a little bit to new terrain for me within Hegel's philosophy, namely kind of the anthropology, as a way of just trying to think about the extent to which Hegel enables us to think about pathological forms of skepticism. So that's basically, yeah, what's brought me to this project. But before jumping in, I want to thank the conference organizers for just making this event possible. It's been really, really enjoyable. I've learned a whole lot already. And thanks for all the presenters as well, and for all the attendees. As I said, I have, this is kind of new work for me and stuff that's very much a work in progress. So I'm really interested to see to what extent, you find this parallel that I'm going to try to develop here compelling, to what extent you're just like, no, this is just kind of a, you're kind of reading things into the text, you're seeing things here. Because again, this is very much, a starting point for a project of mine. So I guess with that, I will, I guess I'll jump right in. So skepticism has long been considered an important element of healthy reasoning and sound common sense. Indeed, at least since the time of Sextus Empiricus, it has even been prescribed as an effective treatment for a variety of mental and spiritual afflictions. According to Sextus, those who hold the opinion that things are good or bad by nature are perpetually troubled. Troubled, for instance, by an excessive pride and arrogance in the possession of good things, or an unsettling awareness that they may soon be lost. The modes of skepticism, however, purport to offer a remedy for such a troubled mind, promising both mental tranquility and moderation of feeling through the suspension of judgment and the cessation of belief. By contrast, for modern thinkers such as Descartes, the value of skepticism lies not so much in its therapeutic potential as in its epistemic significance. And for Descartes, skepticism's greatest utility lies in freeing us of all prejudices, Descartes says, in preparing the easiest way for us to withdraw the mind from the senses, and finally, in making it impossible for us to doubt any further those things that we later discover to be true. But if skepticism can be generally counted on as an effective tool for critical thinking, there is surely also a point at which it becomes genuinely pathological. Obsessive indecision, crippling self-doubt, and the paranoid mistrust of all authority present cases in which the skeptical inclination to question has grown into something pernicious. Philosophical discussions of skepticism tend, however, as a general rule, to ignore such cases, presenting skepticism rather as a method for avoiding dogmatic beliefs and generating epistemic certainty. And while this focus has given rise to crucial developments in the theory of knowledge, it has also contributed to the overall impression that skepticism is a narrowly epistemological problem, warranting a narrowly epistemological solution. Such solutions are, of course, in ready supply in the history of philosophy, but they seem to offer little relief from the afflictions just described. So, in this presentation, I would like to suggest that Hegel provides the conceptual elements for conceiving of skepticism not merely as an epistemological problem, but also as a psychical condition. As I'll argue, however, this possibility only comes into view when we consider two parallel discussions within Hegel's corpus in connection with one another: his treatment of skepticism in the 1807 Phenomenology of Spirit, and his discussion of madness proper, or manic folly, in the Anthropology. And so if Hegel's discussion of madness can indeed be mapped onto his earlier treatment of skepticism, then I would like to consider whether the parallelism between these two accounts might warrant these further following conclusions. First, that Hegel's analysis of the three main forms of derangement in the Anthropology, weak-spiritedness, madness proper, and insanity, can be understood as a reworking of the patterns of consciousness that he examines in the 1807 Phenomenology under the heading of Stoicism, Skepticism, and Unhappy Consciousness. Secondly, I want to think about whether that Hegel's philosophy allows us to consider skepticism in terms of its psychical and affective features. And three, that skepticism, and this kind of is where my talk, I think, starts getting closer to the topic of Will's talk. The skepticism can be occasioned by specific social and historical conditions, such as those that Hegel considers in relation to madness. So these are the questions I'm trying to build up toward in trying to lay out this kind of what I see as a very close parallel development between these sections of Hegel's philosophy. So Hegel's 1807 Phenomenology examines the process by which spirit liberates itself from the oppositions of consciousness and advances to the standpoint of philosophical science. Hegel describes the standpoint of philosophical science here, or absolute knowing, as the point at which knowing no longer needs to go beyond itself, where knowing finds itself and where the concept corresponds to the object and the object to the concept. To advance to this standpoint, spirit must abandon all the familiar oppositions through which it has hitherto come to understand its knowing activity. And so consciousness, self-consciousness, and reason represent the three primary stages by which natural consciousness loses its truth. So very quickly, in consciousness, spirit is led to renounce its conviction that the truth of knowing falls exclusively on the side of the object of knowledge. In self-consciousness, spirit is driven to the opposite conclusion, namely, that the truth of knowing falls exclusively on the side of the subject of knowledge. Finally, reason is, in Hegel's words, right, the certainty which consciousness has of being all reality, the stage at which spirit finally relinquishes the presumed mutual exclusivity of knowing and known and grasps its object as its own. So if self-consciousness is the general stage in which spirit turns away from its object and towards itself, the patterns of Stoicism, Skepticism, and Unhappy Consciousness represent three forms of spirit's self-estrangement. Three ways, that is, by which self-consciousness strives unsuccessfully to liberate itself from its own constitutive otherness. And Hegel writes in the Phenomenology of Spirit, it is in confronting an other that the I is itself. At the same time, however, self-consciousness reaches out over and beyond this other, which for the I is likewise only itself. So in Stoicism, self-consciousness withdraws from the bustle of existence and retreats into the pure universality of thought. In Skepticism, self-consciousness achieves the certainty of its freedom through negating the being of the manifoldly determinate world. And finally, in Unhappy Consciousness, self-consciousness finds itself divided in two, as the contradiction between singular individuality and its unchangeable essence. Okay, so I'm just going to go through Stoicism, Skepticism, Happy Consciousness, just to kind of remind us all kind of what goes on in these patterns of consciousness. So Hegel's discussion of Stoicism in the Phenomenology is evidently inspired by the Hellenistic debate concerning the criterion of knowledge. However, rather than focusing on the features of Stoic epistemology, Hegel presents this pattern of consciousness in contrast to the figure of the Lord, from the immediately preceding discussion of lordship and bondage. While the Lord attempted to establish its independence and self-sufficiency by consuming the things it had commanded the bondsman to prepare for its enjoyment and abstracting from its dependency on the latter, the Stoic locates its freedom in the abstract universality of thought. For the Stoic, freedom does not consist in asserting oneself over the otherness it encounters. Rather, as Hegel writes here, it consists in being free within all the dependencies of his singular existence, whether on the throne or in fetters, and in maintaining the lifelessness which consistently withdraws from the bustle of existence, withdraws from actual doing as well as from suffering, and withdraws into the simple essentiality of thought. So I'm going to return to Hegel's discussion of Stoicism later in comparison to his description of weak-spiritedness, the first variety of mental derangement he presents in the Anthropology. For now, what I want to do is I want to call attention to what I take to be kind of the basic conceptual determinations at work in Hegel's description of Stoicism. So specifically, I want to kind of point out that the pattern of consciousness that Hegel calls Stoicism is organized around a kind of antagonism or opposition, right? Namely between the pure universality of thought and what he refers to here as the bustle of existence. So these are kind of what I'm calling the constitutive poles of Stoicism. Further, I would like to emphasize that these two poles are not for the Stoic simply opposed to one another. Rather, the relationship between them is best understood in terms of the logical determination that Hegel presents in the logic of essence as identity or self-identity. This is not speculative identity, this is reflective identity, right? So to say that the pure universality of thought and the bustle of existence stand for the Stoic in a relationship of identity is not to say that they're simply one and the same. Rather, it is to say that the Stoic becomes certain of themselves as the pure universality of thought only in withdrawing completely from the bustle of existence to which it is indifferently opposed. And so from the logic, the concept of identity, a simple negativity that refers itself to itself, is not the product of external reflection, but derives from being itself. Contrary to this, he continues, the identity that stays distant to difference and the difference that stands distant to identity are the products of external reflection and of an abstraction that arbitrarily clings to this point of indifferent difference. So throughout this talk, I'm going to try to explain or boil down Stoicism, skepticism, and anti-consciousness on the one hand, and weak-spiritedness, madness proper, and insanity. To I think that we can see them as organized by or governed by logical determinations that Hegel works out in the logic. At least that's what I'm going to suggest. So, skepticism. If for Hegel, skepticism represents the attempt to achieve freedom and self-sufficiency by withdrawing into the abstract universality of thought, skepticism can be understood as a mode of thinking which attempts to establish its own absolute independence by tearing down everything firm which would stand in its way. If, however, the skeptic can only establish its own independence by negating all otherness it finds standing before it, this means that it is, in fact, dependent on the negation of this otherness to achieve its self-certainty. Although the skeptic supposes that all knowledge is simply the self-knowledge of a stable, self-identical, and radically independent subjectivity, it turns out that what it really knows is an utterly dependent figure, which can escape the contingency of existence no more than the otherness that it seeks to annihilate in thought. What it knows is, in Hegel's words, the dizziness of a self-engendered disorder. And now reading a longer quote from Hegel's analysis of skepticism and phenomenology, Hegel says, this consciousness is thus the senseless rambling, bewusstlose Fasselein, that goes to and fro from one extreme of self-equal self-consciousness to the other extreme of contingent, disordered, and disordering consciousness, and does not itself bring either of these two thoughts of itself into contact with each other. At one time, it has cognizance of its freedom as an elevation above all the disarray and contingency of existence. And at another time, it again just as much avows that it is backsliding into inessentiality and wandering aimlessly within it. And so, as with Stoicism, I want to say that skepticism too can be understood as organized around two poles, namely around two opposing conceptions of its thinking activity. So the skeptic understands itself on the one hand as self-equal self-consciousness that remains imperturbably indifferent to all otherness confronting it, and on the other, as the contingent, disordered, and disordering consciousness that demonstrates the nullity of every fixed determination. And so, in contrast to Stoicism, however, which presents the two poles by which it is constituted in a relationship of identity, essential identity, or self-identity, the two constitutive poles of skepticism, I think, are best understood in terms of the logical determination of opposition. So to say that the skeptic's two competing conceptions of itself as self-equal self-consciousness and contingent, disordered, and disordering consciousness, that they stand in a relationship of opposition, is to say, in Hegel's words, that each has its own determination only in its relation to the other, is only reflected in itself as it is reflected in the other, and the same holds for the other. Each is thus the other's own other. Accordingly, the skeptic is unable to bring together these two competing conceptions of its thinking activity and must instead ceaselessly vacillate between them. In the figure of the unhappy consciousness, however, the two moments which the skeptic could consider only in their alternation and succession become united in one consciousness. So in Hegel's words, he says here in this long quote, "This new shape is thereby one that is for itself the doubled consciousness of itself as self-liberating, unchangeable, self-equal consciousness, and of itself as absolutely self-confusing, self-inverting, and it is the consciousness of its being this contradiction." It continues, "Although the doubling of self-consciousness within itself, which is essential in the concept of spirit, is thereby present, its unity is not yet present, and the unhappy consciousness is the consciousness of itself as a doubled, only contradictory creature. Because to itself the contradiction of its essence is one consciousness, this unhappy and estranged consciousness within itself also must always have in one consciousness that of an other consciousness." Accordingly, I would suggest that the two poles through which the unhappy consciousness is constituted are the same as those at work in skepticism, right? Between self-equal self-consciousness and contingent, disordered, and disordering consciousness. In the case of the unhappy consciousness, however, these two poles can be said to stand in a relationship not of opposition, but of contradiction. So moving on now to the Anthropology. So in 1817, Hegel published the first edition of the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences. In this work, we find a significantly revised version of the Phenomenology of Spirit. Here, the phenomenology is no longer presented as an introduction to the system of philosophical science, but rather as just one part of the latter, namely as the second part of the philosophy of subjective spirit. Many parts of the earlier Jena phenomenology are omitted in this later version, including notably the majority of reason and the final sections on spirit, religion, and absolute knowing in their entirety, right? These are just completely dropped in the revised version of the Phenomenology of Spirit. Most importantly, for our purposes, we also no longer find in the encyclopedia version of the Phenomenology of Spirit Hegel's discussion of Stoicism, skepticism, and unhappy consciousness. And so one of the questions I want to kind of raise in thinking about this issue is, well, what, if anything, becomes of Stoicism, skepticism, and happy consciousness for Hegel after 1807? And of course, as I'm going to suggest, I think that we can see him as maybe reworking some of these arguments and ideas in the Anthropology. So Hegel's Anthropology. The philosophy of subjective spirit offers an account of the incremental stages by which spirit emerges from its natural determination and achieves a comprehension of its concept. As the mind is a copy of the eternal idea exhibited in the science of logic, the development here proceeds in accordance with the three fundamental categories of absolute reality established in that work, being essence and concept, unfolding across the three stages of anthropology, phenomenology, and psychology. While the latter two stages, namely phenomenology and psychology, present spirit respectively as consciousness, where it appears in relation to an external object by which it is mediated, in the case of phenomenology, and as a mind that grasps the mediations through which it knows itself as its own, in the case of the psychology, the first of these stages finds spirit in its most immediate form, as it emerges from out of the grip of nature as soul. So it's here in the Anthropology that Hegel examines those aspects of mental life that he sees arising at the boundary where nature and spirit meet. Hegel divides the Anthropology into the three stages of the natural soul, the feeling soul, and the actual soul. Once again, the progression here mirrors the tripartite division of the logical idea. So in the case of the natural soul, so first of all, the natural soul, just as being, its logical counterpart, is characterized by its sheer immediacy and abstract self-reference, so too the natural soul with which the Anthropology begins is defined by its simplicity and apparent lack of mediation. At this stage, the stage of the natural soul, the soul is so absorbed in the natural factors determining its existence, for example, the cycle of the seasons, the hours of the day, the physical and sexual maturation of the body, that it can neither differentiate itself from the affections engendered by these factors, nor consciously contrive to exert control over them. It simply relates to these natural determinacies immediately, as inseparable features of its own inchoate identity. In the second part of the Anthropology, the feeling soul encounters the same content in which it was previously immersed in the natural soul. If in the preceding stage of its development, the soul was defined in terms of its immediate identity with and lack of distinction from the elements composing its natural existence, here it is characterized by its division, separation, and rupture with the latter. The feeling soul is not, however, simply cut off from its natural condition. Rather, what's distinctive about this stage in the soul's evolution is rather its mediation by a corporeal reality of which it is now aware as its essence, but over which it struggles to maintain decisive control. It's in this context that Hegel discusses derangement. In the final stage of the Anthropology, the actual soul will come to attain such control as it gains the ability to properly order the various feelings and representations pressing upon it in accordance with the objective interconnection in which they are concretely situated. In doing so, the soul will have surmounted its bodily nature, achieving a kind of mediated unity with its naturalness that parallels the self-mediating activity of the concept. So now on to the concept of derangement, which again falls within Hegel's treatment of the feeling soul, the second kind of stage in the Anthropology. Hegel offers several formulations of the concept of derangement, Verrücktheit, in the Anthropology. In each of these formulations, however, derangement is said to involve an opposition, contradiction, or deremption between two competing versions of the objective reality in which the subject finds itself embedded. One rooted in the shared world available to all sober and healthy individuals, the other springing from a particular feeling which has become dislodged and isolated from the latter. The conflict here is not merely one between two independent and equally persuasive perspectives. Hegel rather understands it as a regression or descent from one stage in the soul's development the actual soul, to the one directly preceding it, the feeling soul. And here's the longer quote on the concept of derangement. By this descent, Hegel writes, the concrete I loses its absolute power over the entire system of its determination, forfeits the ability to put everything coming to the soul in the right place, to remain perfectly present to itself in each of its representations. And by letting itself be captivated by a particular, merely subjective representation, is driven out of its wits, is shifted out from the center of its actuality, and since it also still retains a consciousness of its actuality, acquires two centers, one in the remnants of its intellectual consciousness, the other in its deranged representation. So Hegel acknowledges that derangement is an infinitely varied condition that could be indicated by a wide range of symptoms and modes of behavior. However, rather than attending to the diverse and contingent ways it is manifest in the lives of individuals, Hegel's interest is in articulating the concept of derangement and the three main forms by which it is manifest. And so Hegel identifies the three main forms of derangement as weak-spiritedness, madness proper, and insanity. So I'm going to go through these three main forms of derangement for Hegel. So first of all, weak-spiritedness. Hegel characterizes the first of the three main forms of derangement in terms of the soul's submergence within itself, with its emptiness and indeterminacy, and general lack of awareness of its immediate circumstances. Hegel discusses three general subtypes in this connection: imbecility or Blödsinn, absent-mindedness or Zerstreuheit, and rambling, Fasselei. So Hegel describes imbecility as here the quite indeterminate submergence in oneself, which occasionally reveals itself as catalepsy, as a complete paralysis of both corporeal and mental activity. By absent-mindedness, Hegel understands a non-awareness of the immediate present, a submergence into entirely abstract self-feeling. And finally, rambling, Fasselei, signifies for Hegel an inability to fix attention on anything determinate, the illness of stumbling from one object to another. So whether the individual soul is shut up in a catatonic or otherwise insensible state, as in the case of imbecility, finds itself absorbed in one particular feeling or representation, which prevents it from achieving conscious awareness of the matter at hand, in the case of absent-mindedness, or finds itself stumbling from one object to another, incapable of focusing its attention on any given determinate content, in the case of rambling. Each of these conditions, I will argue, can be understood in reference to the two constitutive poles of entirely abstract self-feeling on the one hand and objective consciousness on the other. So you see here, I'm trying to, try to figure out exactly where the correspondence between these patterns might lie, in trying to put this in terms of constitutive poles and logical determination. And so, as in the case of Stoicism in the Hegelian phenomenology, the relationship obtaining between the two poles of entirely abstract self-feeling and objective consciousness here can be understood once again as one of identity, or essential identity from the logic. Madness proper. Hegel refers to the second main form of mental derangement as madness proper, eigentliche Narrheit, or simply as folly, Narrheit. Although he does not make explicit the full range of pathologies that fall under this heading, his account includes a discussion of obsessive ideas, grandiose and persecutory delusions, melancholy, world weariness, and despair. Such afflictions are evidently distinct from one another. On Hegel's account, however, each of these share a common oppositional structure, whereby the mind sticks fast in an individual, merely subjective representation and regards it as something objective. Once again, madness proper can be understood in terms of the two poles of subjective representation or particular feeling, and objective consciousness on the other hand. And as opposed to the forms of weak-spiritedness, where the two poles of entirely abstract self-feeling and objective consciousness stand in a relationship of identity, here madness proper is best conceived in terms of the logical determination of opposition. Rather than abstracting or withdrawing from one pole entirely into the other, as in the case of weak-spiritedness, here the soul alternates between the two poles by which it is constituted, again vacillating back and forth between their particular feeling or subjective particularity on the one hand, and the objective interconnection in which they're situated on the other. So Hegel refers to the third main form of derangement, finally, as insanity. And he describes the latter as a phenomenon where the deranged subject himself is aware of being torn apart into two mutually contradictory modes of consciousness. A vivid feeling of the contradiction between his merely subjective representation, but insists on making it an actuality or annihilating what is actual. And again, in the case of insanity, the two poles I want to say are at work here are the same as those we saw in madness proper. Once again, between subjective representation or particular feeling on the one hand, and on the other hand, objective consciousness, or what Hegel sometimes refers to as intellectual consciousness. Rather than standing in a relationship of opposition, however, the two poles of insanity can be understood in terms of the logical determination of contradiction. So this is just kind of a general rough sketch of how I'm kind of seeing the parallelism between these two accounts. Now I kind of want to turn to just kind of reviewing a bit of the evidence that I think supports the kind of seeing these two accounts as parallel or as mirroring each other. So first, some terminological evidence. Hegel describes skepticism at one point in the Jena Phenomenology as senseless rambling, bewusstlose Faselei. In the Anthropology, Hegel uses the same term, rambling, Faselei, to refer to the second subtype of weak-spiritedness. In the Jena Phenomenology, Hegel describes skeptical argumentation as the vanity, Eitelkeit, of its own knowing, and in the lectures in the history of philosophy identifies, as the vanity of consciousness, Eitelkeit des Bewusstseins. And Hegel is pretty much always using this term Eitelkeit when he's talking about skepticism throughout his corpus. Interestingly, in his discussion of madness proper in the Anthropology, Hegel identifies the passion of vanity as its chief cause, Eitelkeit again. And finally, Hegel presents unhappy consciousness, unglückliche Bewusstsein, as a pattern of self-consciousness in the Phenomenology, while in the Anthropology, he characterizes insanity as an unhappy feeling, unglücklichen Gefühl, of being in contradiction with oneself. So besides these terminological similarities just indicated, I'd also just like to underscore the fact that the progression from Stoicism to unhappy consciousness in the Phenomenology of Spirit, it closely parallels the development from weak-spiritedness to insanity presented in the Anthropology. In each case, the movement proceeds from a figure of identity, which abstracts and withdraws from the objects confronting it, to a figure of opposition, which vacillates back and forth between two opposing determinations, and concludes with a figure of contradiction, which finds itself pulled in two directions at once. I'd also just kind of point out here that within the Anthropology, Hegel says at least twice that it's difficult to determine where error becomes madness. That's kind of where I get the title of this presentation from. So he seems to be kind of a little bit unsure, I think, of how he wants to make sense of the relationship between error and madness here. And finally, Hegel presents both of these parallel developments in self-consciousness and in the feeling soul in terms of the subject's failure to successfully integrate the givenness or externality in which it is embedded into its own conscious experience. So now just some brief conclusions that I want to see if they seem to be supported by reading these two accounts alongside one another. So given the parallels between these two accounts that I've been considering, I'd like to briefly suggest the following conclusions. First, that Hegel's engagement with skepticism, especially in the Phenomenology of Spirit, informs his understanding of mental illness. That he's drawing from essentially the material that he worked out in the earlier Phenomenology of Spirit in trying to make sense of the phenomenon of mental illness that he explores in the later Anthropology. Secondly, if I can go even further within this connection, I might suggest that we consider whether skepticism and madness represent for Hegel two sides of the same phenomenon. So more specifically, I'd like to suggest that the Jena phenomenology perhaps presents the conceptual and epistemological dimensions of skepticism, while the anthropology can be said to present its psychical and affective features. And finally, I want to end here by raising the question, which Will was, I think, exploring in his paper. So here's kind of the where I think they really connect the most. I want to end by raising this question about whether the parallelism I've been kind of trying to develop here might suggest that pathological forms of skepticism can be occasioned by certain social and historical conditions, such as those Hegel discusses in relation to madness. Commenting on the emergence of insanity, Hegel writes the following. It is implied, and Will, I don't know if you know this passage, but this is the one that I think really is, super relevant to, connecting together maybe both of our talks here. So Hegel writes, it's implied in the concept of mania or insanity just indicated that it need not spring from an empty illusion, but can be brought about particularly by a stroke of great misfortune, by a derangement of someone's individual world, or by the violent upheaval and coming out of joint of the universal state of the world, if the individual lives with his heart exclusively in the past and thus becomes unable to reconcile himself to the present, by which he feels himself at once rejected and bound. In the French Revolution, for example, many people became insane by the collapse of almost all civic relationships. So I want to end here by just posing the question of whether we can see whether under such alienating social conditions we might expect pathological forms of skepticism to begin to take hold. That's all I have. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much for all of this. Yeah, I'm so glad that you folks were put next to each other, because I think those were incredibly complementary presentations. Yeah, I am going to start asking if folks have any questions in regards to this. I'd be interested if Will has any commentary to add, since we had the interchange earlier. Yeah, but yeah, if anyone has any questions, feel free to put your hands up. And if not, I might actually pull you in, Will, because I'd love to see this interaction.
Currently trying to collect my thoughts here, but yeah, really, really fantastic. Yeah, like I could see even at the beginning of the presentation, like all the pieces fitting together in like this really beautiful way. I mean, I wonder, so I think, okay, let's see. I think I have a couple of questions. So the way that you articulate this is often as like a correspondence, a parallel, a mirroring. And like you brought up really interestingly, like the encyclopedia drops the discussion of Stoicism and skepticism. So I wondered, like, I mean, even just like purely speculatively, like, do you think there was like something that's like captured by his discussion of derangement or madness in encyclopedia that like maybe he failed to capture somehow in the Stoicism, skepticism, unhappy consciousness development? And then I also, I mean, insofar as he definitely thinks they're both, let's see, he definitely thinks, I guess maybe I want to ask, like, just how far you're maybe willing to go on like the kind of ontological equivalency of these, because I do wonder whether maybe like the experience of Stoicism and madness, like, you know, there's this inward turn, there's this inability to take, you know, full account of one's like you know, objective actuality, but like that the experience of being like, you know, deeply skeptical of one's world versus like what he describes as like the, you know, the anguish of madness proper, or insanity, or maybe better, insanity, where there's like this kind of awareness of the contradiction.
Yeah, thanks, Will. I think I had a similar experience right after hearing your talk, because, you know, I've been thinking about, you know, madness and Hegel, you know, along a certain, you know, in a certain way that was a bit different than how you're presenting it. I mean, maybe not ultimately too different, but yeah, I was still very much gathering my thoughts in response to yours. But I guess, let's see. So one question was about the correspondence or the mirroring between these two accounts. And, you know, at this point, I don't have a great answer, you know, for in terms of how far I'm willing to go with, you know, the kind of ontological relationship between these two. You know, I have tried to look through, you know, as much of the literature as I can. And the only person that I've seen making this connection at all is Daniel Bertolt Bond. And he brings it up in relationship to Hippolyte, and really just to reject Hippolyte's, you know, argument that we can kind of see, you know, we can understand insanity or madness as kind of like a general ontological condition. And so he kind of, you know, makes a little bit of the case that I'm trying to really develop and bring out here in that work. But he ultimately wants to say, oh, well, they're up to different things. You know, and so we shouldn't necessarily see them in connection. I want to, as far as I will go right now, based on all the evidence that I've tried to collect, I want to say that, you know, it's really the, you know, as I said before in the presentation, the kind of epistemological, conceptual elements of kind of the pathological forms of self-consciousness or maybe skepticism, you know, they're presented there in the phenomenology. Whereas maybe in anthropology, we see Hegel really sketching out its psychical and affective features. So that's as far as I'm willing to speculate at this point, given that there's nobody that I've seen that have connected these two discussions, and yet I'm just, you know, I'm just compelled to read them beside one another. But I guess going to your other question about what might Stoicism, skepticism, and happy consciousness fail to capture that perhaps is there in anthropology, I think, you know, very basically, it has to do with feeling and the kind of status of, you know, how it is that, you know, skepticism is not just a kind of like, you know, conceptual puzzle, right? Stoicism is not just a kind of matter of mere concepts, but I think that, you know, there we have the way in which they take on a kind of bodily reality, which is something that, you know, I think a lot of us might be surprised to see in Hegel, as this kind of like really interesting account of feeling and the body as, you know, playing some sort of role, you know, in terms of the manifestation of these logical and conceptual determinations that he presents elsewhere. So that's about as much as as far as I've kind of gone in terms of thinking, you know, how these kind of maybe fit together. But I'm really open to any suggestions at this point. You know, I really feel like I need to take a close look at the law of the heart, and, you know, really take seriously Beautiful Soul now. So yeah, any suggestions, I'm very happy to hear. So I will shut up, and maybe there's another question.
Yeah, well, before I ask my question, do you have any follow-up to what we just mentioned, or yeah, just should check in beforehand?
Yeah. I think I have like a couple of follow-ups. I mean, like, so on the one hand, like, I wonder whether, Hegel might, so on the one hand, you could say that skepticism like is, pathological in itself, or insofar as like maybe skepticism is sort of like madness light, insofar as like maybe a skepticism could like, kind of descend then further down into a kind of madness, like might be one way of thinking about it. And then I'll maybe just make one comment too, like, about, because you brought up the love of heart and the beautiful soul, and you also brought up that like great, I think it's in a footnote in my article, but the where he takes into account like this like social like determinants, almost you could say, or social conditions causing madness. And I think like one key difference, it seems to me, and I'm curious maybe your thoughts, but there seems to me that there's a difference between, on the one hand, saying that one's social conditions provoke or cause a kind of madness or regression to madness, and then madness, on the other hand, which I think is what's going on, and why I think they're kind of actually like ontologically distinct in the phenomenology, where it emerges out of an internal to spirit's development. And so maybe, I don't know, that's where I see maybe the difference there, and something that I think it was like an option that I thought maybe like Rotelbahn like didn't maybe acknowledge, because he did acknowledge like, we should be looking more at the social dynamics aspects of or causes of madness. But yeah.
Awesome.
Oh yeah, thanks again for, if I could just really quickly follow up, Simone.
Yeah, of course, go ahead.
So, I mean, just this kind of question of, at what point does skepticism cease to be a kind of, mere conceptual problem, or even just like a helpful kind of tool within, philosophy or critical thinking, but at what point does it become something more pathological? I mean, that's really the impetus, for thinking about this paper. At what point does skepticism, take on a specifically kind of pathological form? So, I mean, that's very much what I'm trying to think about, is not that skepticism for Hegel in the Phenomenology of Spirit is, identical, or he thinks of skepticism as identical to madness, but that I think that he has the ability to account for a descent from maybe more healthy skepticism into what we might call more unhealthy forms of skepticism. So that's, just to really quickly respond to that. In terms of your other question about kind of like how to think about, the determination, social kind of conditions for madness versus maybe kind of what we see in the phenomenology, that's still something I really need to just think more about. That's, a big question, which I just haven't really investigated too much at this point. But I mean, I end with that quote that I really like from Hegel, because, it seems to me that, he's suggesting there that alienation, the kind of experience of alienation, however we want to understand it, is really the way to understand why, madness and perhaps pathological forms of, self-consciousness or skepticism seem to take hold. I still need to kind of, I think, work that stuff out some more. But yeah, I'll just leave it there for now.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you so much for that. I think the only thing I have left is, I actually forgot what I was going to ask, because there was a point in one of your answers that I was really curious about. But yeah, maybe it's better to move along. Thank you so much, Miles. That was an incredible presentation. All right, so
thank you.
Yeah. Next, I have Joseph.